Happy Hanukkah. Good. Welcome to class 84, Faith and Calm. And tonight we're going to talk about Hanukkah. What else do we talk about on Hanukkah? So actually, I listened to my last year's class and I thought it was very good. A lot of inspirational things to say. Listen to yourself sometimes. Oh, there's Amy. Very good. So we're going to talk about Hanukkah tonight. But we'll start with a little joke or story or something like that. So I think it fits. So there was this Jewish guy named, let's give him a name, Yaakov. And he was arrested by the KGB in Russia and he was put in prison. And while he was there, he got a letter from his wife. Now, everything that you came in or out letters, of course, was checked by the KGB and censored. So in the letter, he sees his wife's saying, you know, it's getting to be wintertime. And we need to plant the potatoes. We won't have any food for next year. And it's just too cold and too hard. I cannot dig up the soil. So in the garden. So Yaakov writes his wife back and says, whatever you do, don't dig up the ground. That's where I buried all the guns. And he writes the letter back. And of course, the censors see it. And the next day, a whole group of Russian soldiers appear at the house and they're digging the whole yard up. And then she writes back and says, you know, soldiers came and they dug up the whole yard. And he writes back and he says, good, now you can go plant the potatoes.
Very good. Very good.
Okay. Well, what does that mean psychologically? This is a class. This is about psychologically. The thing is that sometimes we see something and we think of it as, you know, the soldiers thought that they were destroying something and it was bad. And it was, it actually wasn't bad, you know, but it was sometimes in order to get to the new level, you have to somehow you have to go to, you have to do a destruction. You have to remove the old paradigms in order to reach a new level, a new understanding of something. And that is very much sometimes when we see a panic, we're distressed, we're losing faith or something of the sort. And the answer really is really, this is actually Hashem's way of opening up new channels for ourselves. And this is very much connected with, I think, with the story of Hanukkah. We'll see. We'll connect it to the story of Hanukkah. The biggest question about Hanukkah, my wife is going to go show our menorah here. Right? There you go. There we got the candles. Okay. Beautiful. Is in the Gemara, they asked the question, what is Hanukkah? And it wasn't long after the actual event. What is Hanukkah? Most people think Hanukkah, yeah, it was the Maccabees. They beat the Syrian Greeks because Greek culture did not die with Alexander the Great, but rather they splintered. There was the Egyptian Greek culture, and then there was the Syrian, and there was the Asia Minor, and each one was four different generals. Each one continued the Greek philosophy, and the Jews were originally underneath the Egyptians, the Ptolemies, but then after Ptolemy V, the Syrians took over Israel, and they were underneath the Seleucids. And Antiochus was the leader of them, and he banned all sorts of Jewish practices, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, learning Torah, and so forth. And but other things he didn't bother with. Anyway, so it seems like the battle was the main thing. And yet, for some reason, the rabbis got onto this idea that the main thing about Hanukkah is that menorah with the oil. And that's what we're going to try and explain tonight, because I think that we need to understand what the message is. What? Doesn't show it. Doesn't show it. No. What is the message and what is the lesson into our personal lives today about this oil that they found and it lasted for 8 days. So what was the idea? So one thing we know about the Greeks, we know about it today, is that they were very intellectually active. They were great historians. They wrote plays. They had art. They really introduced all of this stuff into the ancient world, which really didn't exist before. Historians weren't there before. Sciences, philosophy. They were a tremendous celebration of the human experience. They had the sports, the Olympics, and so forth. And they celebrated everything. They had affirmations for everything about the human. And in fact, even as I think I said before, even their gods were sort of miniature humans. The gods, the previous to them, were were completely ethereal, but their gods were very human with human passions and human feelings. And this was Greek culture. This was Greek culture, and they really did it very well. And they viewed themselves as very moral people. And maybe they were good people, at least that lived their own lives. And but they came into a clash and a conflict with the Jews. And we have to understand what this clash was, because it was not like Hitler, and it was not like Haman. They didn't want to kill off all the Jews, and the anti-Semitism was not about. They didn't even hate the Jewish religion, really. They thought it was very interesting, intellectual, they books and so forth. They also got interested in it. So, but they did have a conflict. They did have a problem with Judaism, and we need to understand what that problem was and why this became a important thing. And it's even important today in understanding a lot of ourselves and about current history. So basically, in a nutshell, and I'll explain it, but the idea was that the Greeks were big on humanism. They believed that the measure of everything, of whether something is good or bad, was a human thing. Humans are the ones who, it has to make sense to me. It has to be logical. And if I understand it and I appreciate it, that's good. And if it's something that's ridiculous and stupid, then that's the definition of bad. And that's how they measured everything. The value of things were determined by how intellectually and how reasonable and logical it appeared. And they very much believed in that. And Jews said, that's nice, but you can't really trust human beings. There's mob rule, and there's all sorts of deceptions, and humans can get very involved in themselves and their political standpoints, and this partisan and this partisan, and hate everybody who doesn't agree with them, and that's not good. By the way, it's interesting to note, people think of America as a democracy. It's not really. It's a constitutional republic. Because also the founding fathers were not that happy with mob rule. They saw the dangers of it. If you know anything about the Shays Revolt in Massachusetts and so forth, that was one of the reasons they made a constitution, was they said, we have to have some sort of brakes on this idea of democracy, a Greek word, because although America has democratic principles, it's nevertheless, it's a constitutional republic. Anyway, a side point here. Why is this such an important thing, and why is this? Why is that something to go to war for, to battle for, and to try and hate the Jews for, because the Jews don't agree with you about this humanism? Let's go on a tangent, a little off to the side. And then try and bring it back because we lose ourselves. I was listening to a class the other day. A lecture was, this class was actually based on Rabbi Remez Friedman, but the other class was Rabbi Shais Taub was speaking at a farbrengen of Rabbi Jacobson. And he was saying an interesting thing. He said, this guy is just, Rabbi Shais Taub is very much into psychology. And so he said, I did a little research into the origins of this idea, this 12-step program. What is the 12-step program? Well, we know what the 12-step program is, but what was the origin of it? So he says, actually, it's interesting how it got started. There was this New England WASP, very rich family, and they had a son. I don't know what his name. I don't remember his name. I always say Thurston Howell the Third, but Howell the Third. But anyway, and he was a drunkard. He didn't know what to do. And being a very modern, secularized family, they decided, he needs psychological counseling. And in those days, this was in the early 30s, the two great psychologists in the world were Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And so they decided, and they didn't choose Freud for whatever reasons, which is probably a good thing if you want to understand the story. And they said they chose Carl Jung. And they wrote Carl Jung and they told him the situation. And he says, I've studied him. And I think that what he really needs is to have a spiritual experience. He needs a true spiritual experience. And I don't know what that exactly is, but you'll have to figure it out yourself. But that's what he's really looking for. And this guy went back, he talked to some other people, pastors, priests, and so forth like that. And together they developed this idea of the 12-step program that, you know what, in order to get over drunkenness, you have to rely on a higher power and you have to put yourself in that control of that higher power. And it was very successful. And it took off and it grew and it grew. And, you know, the whole Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12-step program became a big thing. And many years later, in the 60s, the founder said, he was asked, he said, did you ever tell Carl Jung to give him credit, you know, saying, you know, hey, it was your idea. And this was actually, has been a very powerful tool for getting people out of their searching for escape and removing their anxieties by drinking. They instead, they put themselves in the at a higher power. And he said, no, I never did it. So they wrote Carl Jung. And this he was already in his 90s at that time. It was like a few months before he passed away. And one of his last letters that he wrote them, he wrote back and he said, let me see, what did he said there? Sorry. He said, you know, I mean, you know, that indeed was the whole philosophy. And I based that, he wrote his a little quote. It's from Tehillim, the Psalms, Psalm 20:42. And it says, Ka'il tarog al afike mayim, ke nafshi tarog alecha Elohi. Like a hart, a deer, is crying for water, my soul cries for you, oh God. That's what he wrote. That's what Carl Jung wrote. He didn't write it in Hebrew, he wrote it in English, which is a good thing they didn't talk to Sigmund Freud, because Sigmund Freud was a notorious atheist, you know, he wouldn't have got Jew. But yeah, Shlomo Freud. But anyway, so they wrote, and he wrote that. And then even more interesting thing, Carl Jung, if you search for his 80th birthday speech, he gave a speech on his 80th birthday, and they asked him, what was the source of all the different ideas that you came up in psychology? And he said, well, you won't believe this, but there's a certain 17th century Jewish rabbi. His name was Dov Ber of Mezrich, which we know as the Maggid of Mezrich, the follower of the Baal Shem Tov, the one who continued after the Baal Shem Tov, and then it was the Alter Rebbe. So he's the one I based everything on. So it's amazing, you know. He says, you know what people are really looking for, they lose track of what they are. They have they focus on the physical world and the physical things, and they look and they hunt, they look for drugs, and they look for it on the internet, and they look for a better vacation, or they maybe, my husband isn't happy, you know, it says what never really fit well, and this one, and they're always looking for some sort of physical, materialistic, logical reason for this is finally going to help me escape. And what Carl Jung was saying is, you know, sometimes, maybe most of the times, what you're really looking for is a connection with God. That's the ultimate reality. That's what you want. It's not necessarily all the, you know, because we know we've tried it. We've lived a long enough time, and we've tried many different experiences and trips and travels, and you know, and all sorts of interesting substances and stuff like that. And you know, it just never seems to satisfy the soul. And what the Jews were basically saying at the time of Hanukkah was, you know, these things don't, you know, are very nice and they're great, and we don't deny them, and we're not denying that. But ultimately, everything is rooted in a connection with the ultimate reality, which is God. And if you don't have that, it won't really work. And this has been a debate ideologically with the Jews and much of the non-Jewish world. I mean, the non-Jewish world, you know, says, you know, that Judaism, it's too ethereal, it's too abstract. You can't want, you know, the deepest, the thing that people like is something that's relevant to them and it's logical and that they can understand. For example, there's a religion that goes around and says, you know, the following, basically. It says, you know, calling people sinners doesn't really work. We really have to make it much stronger. You have to tell people, one, you have to give them positive reasons why they should be good. So first you tell them you'll be famous and you'll get a lot of rewards and you'll get a piece of heaven and all these other kinds of things and so forth. And then if you're bad, you know what's going to happen? Not only you'll be a sinner, but you'll have to go to a place where there are devils and they're in red and they have pitchforks and they stab you and so forth. You have to bring it down. You have to make it very practical and tangible and something that's visceral, to fear doing sins and to really love the rewards and the pleasures that you'll get when you go to heaven and so forth. That will convince people to be good. And Judaism says that's not really what drives people. It doesn't really work. The ultimate thing is people want to have a connection with God, and you don't understand, but that deep down, that's the psychology. People like to be good and they want to be good. That's why sometimes they'll say, when you tell them you're doing something bad, they'll tell you, I'm not doing anything bad. Don't call me an evil person. They'll move the goalposts and they'll say, what I'm really doing is your definition of what good and bad is, but I'm not doing bad. I don't want to really do bad. So they'll change the definition. They'll want to say, that, I am good. Of course I'm good. I'm doing the good things I'm doing. And what your ideology, your morality, you got the problems and so forth. And they redefine what's good in terms of that. So people really like to be, to think of themselves in a positive light. And they ultimately want to do good things. And we see this out constantly, especially with Jews. There are Jews who seem to be perfectly adaptable into the physical world. They are comfortable with the physical world. They are secular. They don't have anything to do with religion or spirituality or anything else like that. And you think like maybe this person actually is accomplished and happy and doing good by himself. But the fact is that it's that it can't be true. Ultimately there's something missing. There's something lacking in that lifestyle. And that's why people, you see Jews who have all of that and something happens in their life and it snaps. And all of a sudden they go against all of that and they say, I'm sacrificing my life for my Judaism. Daniel Pearl was doing very well, as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He was an editor and so forth. And Leon Klinghoffer and many other Jews. And they don't even know anything really about Judaism. But you know what? When a push comes to shove, they won't leave their Judaism. And that's the deepest level that inside of a Jew. And this is basically the message, believe it or not, of the oil. The Jews were looking, what basically the world says is, if you want people to get on fire and you want them to be illuminated, you have to provide them fuel. The fuel that we're talking about is the fuel of oil. Oil is symbolic of that fuel. That when you have fuel and you have oil, then you'll actually do something. So in order to make people, motivate people to do the right thing and not to do the wrong thing, you got to make it practical. You got to make it tangible. You have to have oil. And the Jews said, a little yes, but you know what? They didn't have the oil. They didn't have 8 days of oil. They found 1 jar of oil. And so there really wasn't any oil. There wasn't enough oil for 1 day, because if there was enough oil for 1 day, we wouldn't celebrate the first night of Hanukkah. We'd only have 7 days of miracle oil. So they found a jar of oil. It wasn't enough for 1 day. And yet they said, this little bit of oil, that can go for 8 days. In other words, there's a certain level of when you squeeze anything, any fruit or any other kind of thing, sunflower seed or anything else, you get oil. The deepest, purest part of any person is the oil inside that person, and oil burns very cleanly. There's no smoke from clean burning oil. Unlike a candle, it's just, I've noticed with my olive oil, menorah, it just doesn't smoke. Inside every Jew, there is a part of oil that's never been touched by the taste of Greek. It's never been touched by logic, by anything else. And inside every single Jew, there is this oil. And that oil is sufficient to light, and to light not for 1 day, but 2 days, for 8 days. It could go on and go on and on and on. And that's what the Jews were looking for. And that's the miracle that we're celebrating on Hanukkah. We're celebrating the ability of the Jew to actually, he doesn't survive necessarily on logic and on rationality, or he can't. He doesn't deny it, but it's that connection to God that actually vitalizes the entire everything in the world. I don't know if I was clear, so let me try and bring that down into a story. So there's a story, I heard it from Rabbi Manis Friedman. He said he was reading this book of a guy who turned in and became a Hasidic Jew. He became secular, and he became a Hasidic Jew, and he was wearing his long coat and the beard and everything else. And he wrote a book about this process of becoming Hasidic. And his family, his brother actually wrote the introduction, and his brother did not become religious. And his brother wrote the introduction explaining how the family was completely shocked about this. He was a budding writer and talented with music, and how horrified they were when he came home and he started, with all this kosher business and about he couldn't be alone in the room with a woman who wasn't part of his family, and they didn't know what to do with him. And the whole family was horrified that he was rejecting modernity and going back to this old kind of religion and so forth. And then Rabbi Friedman said, I looked at the book and I said, when was this written? And he sees it was written in 1929 in Czechoslovakia and Prague. And basically he sums it up and he says, that was the argument of the Greeks. The Greeks thought that they were modern and they were logical and they were scientific and they were rational. And they viewed that this belief in God is something that they just couldn't absorb. That's old time stuff, about a God talking to you and telling you what to do. And
You have to tell us who that was.
what?
Who is the name of this person who wrote that book?
I don't remember. He didn't say what the name.
Okay, I'm sorry. I want to read it.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. So anyway, so he said this argument is still going on today. When to be modern is to be scientific and logical and rational, which is all fine and all very good. But Judaism is saying you start from there and then you have to go further, because there was as we know about Germany. Germany was one of the most well-organized, logical, rational societies that have been on the face of the earth. And yet rationality, logic, and so forth, because of human emotions and desires, can be twisted and turned into something completely atrocious. So the ultimate decision of what is good and bad, we have to have that goal, those goalposts, those directions from Hashem to say, God says, what, this is what's good and this is what's bad. And what Chanukah is all about is the celebration of that, the celebration of that, how to be able to get out of our own mind, how to get out of our own psychology, how to lift ourselves up beyond our physical way of physically oriented society, and to light that little candle, which doesn't, it's not as big as impressive as the other decorations out there in the world right now. But that little light, that little flame, that little bit of gold oil is a stronger force because it's connected to something that's eternal. And of course, we've seen, what happened. The Jews are around, and the Greek culture, the Greek society of then has disappeared. It's not around anymore. And so too everybody who followed that ideology. So that's in a nutshell a little bit about what the holiday of Hanukkah is about. It is a philosophical war, but it's also a tremendous lesson about ourselves and our own capabilities and our own ability to overcome darkness. And as I said at the very beginning, with that little story about the guy in prison and so forth, it's the ability to say, there is darkness in our lives, there is destruction, there is things that go wrong, but we're about transforming the darkness into light, which is why we light the menorah at night, because that little light goes out and it goes out into the world and it transforms the world into something that is it brings a godliness into this world. And with that, I'll turn it over to my wife. She'll continue the story.
Thank you, Yehezkel Shimon. Thank you.
Yehezkel Shimon, that was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. So I'm not going to speak long because I still don't have the world's strongest voice. But tonight is not only, I promised Amy that this is my birthday for bringing, that I would, my birthday was Friday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you so much. It was Friday during the day. And so it's not only my birth, it's not only Hanukkah, it's a little bit of a birthday for bringing.
Good.
So before we begin, does anybody want to say anything? And so I'm so happy that I can see some decorations. I see Amy has something in the background. Makes it so fast.
Hanukkah's right behind this laptop. But I wanted to say that, it's traditional that when you have your Hebrew birthday that you're able to give a blessing. But I also think it's nice to be able to receive some. So last year on your birthday, we were able to give you blessings. And I wanted to offer a blessing for health, for joy, for growth, for all things becoming possible, for continued belief in miracles, and just that everything you give should double back on you. So I hope it's
Yes.
a beautiful
Amen.
year for you.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Beautiful, Amy.
I want to give a blessing to all of you because I want to give, you can give a blessing after your birthday. So I want to give a blessing to all of you. You should have an outstanding year. You should be lights to everybody else in the world, and you should illuminate your section of the world very thoroughly, as you are already doing, and that you should enjoy tremendous health and tremendous love and satisfaction from all your relationships, and growing relationships and growing influence, because you're all extremely powerful women, and I give you the blessing that you realize your potential, and that we have a sweet year together, a sweet year full of
Amen.
miracles.
Amen. Thank you.
So I want to say that, okay, I'm going to start, and I'm going to make an abbreviated session. So, what's this life all about? That's what I want to talk about. And what does it have to do with Hanukkah? And who are we? So we know who we are. We are literally a piece of God above. God, last week we told the story about two businessmen. We told the story about the moon and the sun. And you can go back to last week's session if you want to see it. But essentially, we are literally a piece of God housed in a body. And God sent each one of us, God sent us down into this world, into this darkest of dark worlds. He sent us into this dark world with a mission, with a job. And that job is to make this dark, dark world into a place of light, into a place that will be a home, not only for God, but for us. And how are we supposed to do this job? There are three things that we can do. We have to remember that we are a part of God. In some analogies, we're like married to God. It's like we're like, just as a couple is one, we are one with God. We are inseparable. So we have to remember, I'm not just this.
You know what, Rose, if you're not going to listen, I'm going to leave. I can't do this. I can't fight with you to listen for me.
Okay, just a second. Let me mute somebody.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. So anyway, we have to remember, hey, I have this relationship. I can't forget it. It's not me. I'm not a lone ranger. Number two, we have to remember our assignment. And number three, we have to ignore the darkness, because it's the darkest of dark worlds, and we have to ignore the darkness. But how are we going to do it? How are we going to remember this? This is like an impossible task, because this world is so dark. So there's a remedy. It also has to do with my birthday. My birthday is exactly equidistant between two huge events. One is Yotes Kislev, and the other one is Hanukkah. My birthday is the 22nd, and the 19th of Kislev is 3 days before, and the 25th is 3 days afterwards. And on the 19th of Kislev, the Alter Rebbe was released from prison for spreading Judaism. And when he was released, he spread Hasidus in an entirely different fashion. And he spread Tanya, which is which is the core book of Hasidus in an entirely different fashion. And what is Tanya? Tanya is a book that tells you who you are and what your job is. I remember when I first started learning Tanya, it was like the heavens broke open. Oh, that's what life is all about. And, Steve Freeman from Chabad.org has this project. I hope he finishes it to write Tanya in everyday language. And but even if you can't do that, there's so many books on Tanya that make it accessible. So anyway, we have this against all odds assignment to remember Hashem, to remember that we're in this relationship, to remember that we have a mission, and to ignore the darkness. And many jobs in life are it's like an almost impossible assignment. But there's many things we do that's almost impossible. I think raising kids is probably an almost impossible assignment. Countering the own darkness in your own life, at times it's almost impossible. And yet that's our job. So the Rebbe, our Rebbe, told us, the Lubavitcher Rebbe told us that it's very interesting. What do Hanukkah and Yotes Kislev have in common, besides for the fact that my birthday is smack in the middle of both of them? They have something else in common. And the thing that they have in common is that they both fall in the second half of the Jewish month. Think about it. All the other holidays fall in the beginning of the month. And Yotes Kislev, which is number 19, Yotes means 19, the 19th of Kislev, and Hanukkah, which is the 25th, both fall in the second half of the month. What's the second half of the month? And how is it different from the first half? On the first half, the moon is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a time of growth. All our holidays are in that time. It's a time of obvious growth. But what happens after the 15th? The moon gets, and we represent the moon, I want to tell you, the moon gets small, and Hashem represents the sun. And the moon gets smaller and darker and smaller and darker and smaller and darker. Both these holidays have the same message. And the message is, just because things look darker, it doesn't mean you're moving further away from your goal. If you know anything about astrology, in the second half of the month, when the moon is getting darker and the moon is getting smaller, it's actually getting closer to the sun. It's moving closer to its source. It's getting closer to its goal. So that's the message of both Yotes Kislev and Chanukah. Just because things look dark at times, it doesn't mean we're far from our goal. Adarabba, the opposite is true. And so, for example, in our world today, there is so much assimilation. It's just so incredibly rampant. There's so much anti-Semitism. It's just wild. Never in my lifetime, I'm a child of survivors. I heard about anti-Semitism, but in my lifetime, never been a time like this, never. And yet the Lubavitcher Rebbe told us, Mashiach is here. The Geula is unfolding. Just because it looks like the opposite does not mean it's the opposite. The darker the moon gets, the closer it's getting to its goal. So the same thing in Hanukkah. In Hanukkah, there were so many Greeks. There was so much assimilation. The Jews back then, they were the ones who assimilated, they were called Hellenists. And what was their idea? What was Hellenism? Does anybody know? Anybody know what Hellenism was?
Greek study of the gods, right?
In Hellenism, they embraced Jewish culture. There's nothing wrong with Jewish culture. Just don't say that it has anything to do with God. Say it's a nice custom. Say lighting the candles on Hanukkah is a sweet custom. But don't say God said do this and don't do that. Don't do that. Don't say this is divine. Come on, be real. And most of American Judaism believes that way. They believe these are sweet customs, and they have eliminated a God that says what to do. That does not exist. And so if we cling to the fact that, there is a way, there is a life, there is a way, and it leads to life. It leads to health. It leads to sanity. It leads to everything. We are in the majority. No, we're in the minority. We're in the minority today. And it was the same thing in the time of Hanukkah. And what did Hashem celebrate? He celebrated those few Jews who didn't push him out of the picture. And so I want to end with a tiny little story that I heard from Yossi Jacobson. And if you want to Google it, you should Google it because you should see it in the whole thing. He had a grandmother, went through the Holocaust, went through a lot, and finally got to America, had 9 kids plus a 10th orphan that they adopted. And she raised them. And they tried going to New Jersey. You know, a lot of Jews went to New Jersey to be chicken farmers. Can you imagine Jews as chicken farmers? A lot of them did. And they realized this is not working out. We can't be chicken farmers. It's not working. So they ended up in Brooklyn. And, but she had so many things that were difficult in her life that she dealt with anxiety. And she went to the Rebbe and she told him her problem. And the Rebbe told her, my advice to you is this: go to as many Jewish weddings as possible and dance as much as possible and get everybody else excited about dancing as well. And she took the Rebbe's message to heart. And she went, you know, in Crown Heights, there's a wedding, there's several weddings every night. She went to her relatives' weddings. She went to her friends' weddings. She went to strangers' weddings. She went to weddings of people who didn't have anybody to go to their weddings. And she danced for 4 hours, this old lady. And she became a phenomenon in Crown Heights. On the day of her, and she beat her anxiety. On the day of her passing, the night of her passing, her whole family was at a wedding, a relative's wedding. And then somebody heard she went to the hospital, and they all went to the hospital. And about 40 to 50 relatives surrounded her in the ICU, all in ball gowns and black and tuxedos. And a nurse came in and said, "What's this? A wet?" And she passed away then that night with all her relatives singing and looking like this is the biggest party that they ever saw. So anyway, I want to say that, you know, in this little Nisoyan that I've had for the past few weeks, I found the same solution. First of all, I went through all my solutions. I did everything and I had to invent several more. And when things were getting bad, I got up and I told this to Molly last week, I started moving around the apartment like, oh, like just silly movements. And I want to tell you that it moved worlds. So the message of Hanukkah is not to fight darkness. The message of Hanukkah is to simply add light. Don't fight the darkness, just add light. Dance like you're the happiest person in the world. Say things like you're the happiest person in the world. Make somebody else feel good. And the little lights of Hanukkah, they're so tiny, but they are, it is the holiday of our time. It's the last holiday in Jewish history because it's a message for the last 2,000 years. It is the central message for us today. And that message is add a little light. Don't fight the darkness. And my voice is going, so I'm gonna stop the recording.